In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. It occurs to me that there might be a sense of arrogance in that prayer, which I have said many, many times in my career, in the name of God. And then to turn around and speak, if you don't know that that's frightening, I'll give you a chance to preach. Your turn. Take a turn. And as I say that, I have thought through these weeks and months, it has occurred to me over and over again that I haven't ever said to you, which is something I would say to you if I were here in the long term. It would be to say that when I preach, there is every chance that error will escape my mouth. And certainly, I may say something that you disagree with, or find objectionable, or think is not sustained by the Scriptures. Now, I'm only going to be here a short time, so it's probably good that I've waited till now. But if that were to ever occur, or if you have a memory from some point in the last few months when I said something that you just went, I don't think that. Why did he say that? You know what? I am perfectly willing to hear your objection, as long as you don't come accuse me or assault me. If you want to do that, keep it at home. In the meantime, resurrection. I said to Gail just yesterday, I said, boy, Easter season is hard because how many resurrection sermons can you preach in a row? The people who plan the Scriptures don't have to worry about that. But I want to say we have moved from one gospel to another. We've been reading a lot from John. Earlier in Lent, we read a lot from Mark, but this is Luke's story. Both in the first lesson, the book of Acts, and for those of you who maybe not know this, the same author wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, 2 volumes. One, the life of Jesus up through now, and the second, from the ascension and the sending of the Holy Spirit forward, telling the stories of Peter and Paul particularly. So when you look at Luke's report, his story about the resurrection, actually quite short. He reports, as does John, as does the others, that the first people who went to the tomb were women. They waited because he died on Friday. The Sabbath on Saturday, they could not go and perform the expected duties to the dead. Although he had already been placed in a tomb, it was done hurriedly. And he was simply wrapped in some burial cloths and put in a cave. I mean, maybe all of you know this, maybe you don't. But the first century tombs of the Jews were in general, and certainly among those who could afford it, were carved into the rock and were carved caves, usually with a small entrance down some steps, a very small portico, and then into a larger room in which there would be various shelves. On those shelves, they would place the dead bodies wrapped in cloth. But when prepared properly, the body will have been washed and anointed with oils and spices. Now, this is not a mummification process like the Egyptians, but it was a sense of honoring the body that had carried the spirit of that person. A year later, and even today, among practicing Jews, When someone dies, they do the burial rite very quickly. But a year later, on the day of that person's death, there will be a special ceremony, and all the family will gather again at the synagogue and remember and honor that person. But in the case of first century, they would go back a year later when all of the flesh had disintegrated, had gone through the process that bodies go through. And then they would take the bones and put them in a small, what was called an ossuary. Osteoporosis, bone problems. An ossuary was a small usually carved out of stone, container maybe this long, maybe this wide, maybe this deep. And depending on your wealth, it might have things carved on it. It might just be plain. But they would put all the bones in that and then put it in the back of the family tomb. They did not leave the bodies on the shelves. So, not having the opportunity, the women were bringing the spices. Mary Magdalene, in the case of Luke, he says Mary, mother of James, Cleopas, Joanna, these women and other women, unnamed, all came to the tomb to do the proper respect for Jesus' body, to wash it, to anoint it with all the oils and spices, and then they would have rewrapped the body and left it on the shelf. That's what they expected to do. So it's very clear that none of these people really, no matter what Jesus had said, expected him to be not there. And that's true of every story of the day of Easter, is they expected to find a body and it wasn't there. For Luke, there are two angels waiting to greet them and say, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Well, because he died and he's supposed to be on this shelf and we came to do the proper things. They don't see Jesus. They have whatever this encounter is with the angels. They run back, they tell the disciples, and in all of these cases, the men who are all hiding, women could get away with a lot because, frankly, they weren't considered to be much. A horrible thing to say, and it's certainly nothing I believe today, but women could kind of cruise under the radar, whereas men were identified as actors in history. So Peter comes, the disciples come, they see the empty tomb, they go back. Now you may have noticed that Luke's gospel says that, and then suddenly he appeared among them. So I suggest to you that you go read what just happened before that. I'm giving you way too much history today. But anyway, the collect, back in the old days of the 28 prayer book, everybody raised their hand if you actually worshiped under the 28 prayer book. Yeah, that's a lot of you, actually. There was one set of lessons for the always, a New Testament lesson and a gospel. On a yearly basis, they just repeated. The new prayer book said, that's getting boring. We never hear the Old Testament. And we hear these same lessons over and over and over again. We're going to do a 3-year cycle. That's how we got what we do today. But in the old prayer book, always on this Sunday was the story of the two who left Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus comes to them, and they have this conversation. They go to the house, they break bread, and in the breaking of the bread, they realized who they'd been talking to all along. And earlier they had said, "Don't you know what just happened?" I mean, it's such a funny story. But that is told in Luke, and it's just prior to what we read today. So the two who had met him on the road to Emmaus ran back the 5 or 7 miles, however long it was, and they went back, found the disciples in the upper room, were telling them what had happened, and suddenly Jesus was among them. Very close to the experience of the resurrection in John that we read before last, where Thomas says, "Dang it, I wasn't here. I missed it. I'm not going to believe y'all saw that unless I get to touch the wounds." Well, you notice in Luke, Jesus makes a big point of saying, "See my hands, see my feet, touch me if that's what you need to do. And if you still think I'm a ghost, give me some fish." And he ate it in their presence. Not because the resurrected Jesus needed physical food, but because the importance of what we believe is that the body of Jesus, this thing that we live in, of which we know no life without, was how Jesus lived. And whatever happened in that resurrection, every one of the Gospels insists that what they saw and experienced after was a physically approachable and touchable body that bore the marks of the nails and the spear in his side. Believe it or don't believe it, they all attest to that. And all Christian theology since has depended upon that as our hope. That as our hope. Which is what 1 John talks about. I'm bouncing around, but you're just going to have to stick with me. In all of that process, decades later, when this is all being written down, and even decades later, when John is writing, or the community, someone under the name of John writes these letters, this is what they believed. And they hoped that when Jesus returned, which was what they expected, when the Messiah came back, when the judgment happened, whatever is the end of the human experience, that they might be like him. And even by the time of 1 John, it says, we're not sure what that is. We're still not sure. Why do they call us children? Children aren't sure about anything. They're very accepting. And I'm going to set to the side what I know to be true, that many, many children do not grow up safe and loved. And they live lives of abuse, of violence, of war, of starvation, whatever. So there's this whole category of children who never get to be children because of the trauma they experience. But let's assume that most of us here got to have something that we would call a reasonable childhood, as in America. Children just get to be children. There's a set of boundaries. We're kind of watched over. And in my generation, you climbed on the monkey bars, you swung on the big, tall swing, you got flung off of the merry-go-round. This was the playground I grew up on. And you broke things, and you skinned things, and you rode your bicycle until the street lights came on. For me, childhood was incredibly safe. I lived in a town where my grandparents had built a home in 1935. I wasn't born until 1954. So my mother was a school teacher, my dad was a farmer. I was a known entity, and I was a white male. who was good at school. I had every advantage. So I don't want to say that everybody had my experience in Brownfield, Texas. But as a child, one of my earliest memories is being on the swing in my backyard in Lubbock, Texas, before we moved to Brownfield, singing my heart out. I have no idea what I was singing. I was too young to know any songs, but I was just singing my heart out. I loved to sing, and I was flying. And nobody could have convinced me otherwise. Whatever this evokes for you about your childhood, the truth of most of our childhoods in this room, I think, will probably be that we felt safe, that we felt loved. For most of us, we were raised in some kind of a church or religious community. We were known by name. We were corrected not just by our parents, but by our grandparents and any other adult who saw us misbehaving. They did not hesitate just because they weren't my parents, because the rules were pretty much the same for everybody, all the kids. So what is that? When I think of that, and I really grieve for those who never knew that kind of childhood, because that's the kind of child of God that I imagine in these scriptures. What does it mean when 1 John, when the writer of those letters says, we are children of God? We mess it up when we really try hard to be adults of God, like we know, like we've got it down, we're good. And if I were to look out at you and say, how many of you really felt like an adult when you reached your 50s, those of you who've reached that? How many of you really feel like adult, and how many of you just pretended you were an adult so that other people would think you were one? And yet this opportunity, this opening to enter into this unbelievable story of resurrection, which gives us the chance, invites us into being children before God. These guys have it right. I polished my shoes just to come to church. And they were pretty shiny, I want to tell you. You didn't get to see, but they were shiny. He was so proud. How simple is that? I polished my shoes before I went to church. What a childlike thing to do, and how incredibly honorable that is. So when it says in here, we're made pure, we can't sin if we're in God. And we know, well, I'm either in God or I'm in my own will. When I'm in God, when I am connected, when I'm in communication, when I'm in front of my parents, I rarely misbehave. They go out of town, especially if you're a teenager. Man, I'm right over here in my will. I'm going to go see what that will bring me. Oh my God. If my mother knew how I drove her little Buick when she let me use it to go out to make the drag and get a Coke, and actually we were playing Starsky and Hutch through the streets of Brownfield and flying over the dips in the road. Yeah. We practice our will. And in some cases, we practice it in really good ways. And we learn that there's genuine reward spiritually and emotionally psychologically, that we build self-esteem when we do something that we know was good. And how is it we know that? I would say because in every heart of every human being is carved the image of God. This whole group over here who have been traumatized and never given a childhood like mine, they may never be able to know what that means. But if they do, it's because incredible healing has happened for them. And they may be the extraordinary exception. But it happens. It happens. We never give up hope. For these over here, for the what we would call normal, we get to experience what it is to feel goodness in our heart. And then we grow up and we start making choices. And many of those choices are not towards goodness. And you know it. So John says, the writer of this letter says, when you do those things, it's because you're not in God. You're in your own self-will, separate from God's will. When you're experiencing those wonderful feelings of goodness and doing the right thing and doing something selflessly for another, you know you're in God because you feel whole. The internals of the human being is given the guide. Our emotions aren't irrelevant. They can be dangerous if we just let them drive the bus, but they're not irrelevant. When I feel good about what I'm doing and how I'm treating people and how I'm in relationship with the people I love, I'm at peace. It took me about 70 years to really get there. Because this is like an athletic training. I do more failing than I do succeeding. But when I succeed, the experience, the reward is so immense. When I fail, I just, as an adult, try to cover up. CYA, I won't say it. Where do we live on a daily basis? Where do you live? Can you let go of your adultness? You see, I don't have a lot of, that's not a really great word for me. Adultness is usually about CYA, look good, but may not be good. Way better to be good inside and look bad on the outside, which is exactly what Jesus and his disciples experienced. The hope of the resurrection is that the one who set our example is not gone, is not dead. This is just the road to Emmaus. Jesus appears in the room. They say, and Simon had seen him, and then he disappeared from their sight and went to heaven. On the Easter Sunday, he was gone in Luke's gospel. That quick. And then they had to spend a lifetime trying to figure out what the heck just happened and what does it mean. A lot of you are old. Chronologically. But we can always, if we look back, if we're willing to reconnect with that part of ourselves, that child within, and say, the child within me is most able to believe the stories of God. Most able, because they haven't been trained out of it. They haven't been given a bunch of logical, philosophical, business, whatever, cultural categories to interpret life. They're just open to it. Just open to it. I'll end with this. Do you remember what that cross looked like on Easter Sunday when all the flowers had been put on it? Do you remember that? So long ago. Those of you who were here, on Good Friday we brought it out. It was a wooden cross with chicken wire. Not attractive, and neither was the cross that Jesus was crucified on. It was not attractive. But when I came back, after I had gone out the end of the service and turned around and saw that cross covered in flowers from top to bottom and side to side, it connected me with my childhood in the Episcopal Church, where we did that, in a church that would fit right up here. But the same thing. Beauty, odor, color. A cross that has been transformed from wood and chicken wire into something incredibly beautiful. The resurrection can only be known through aesthetics, poetry, music, emotion, feeling. It makes no sense up here. Children aren't burdened with up here, are they? They're just not burdened with it. Our minds can sometimes be our greatest enemy to faith. You are a child of God. I'm going to go over here and just be quiet. That may be amazing to you. Find that child within and let that child see that flowered cross.